Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to really get into the sources you sent us about a pretty serious situation, a data breach involving a big digital asset exchange and, well, one of the companies they hired to help out. Yeah, you've provided some detailed material here, articles talking about a data leak hitting tens of thousands of users. So our mission, using just the info you shared, is to unpack all of this, figure out the sequence of events, who the main players were, what they allegedly did, how it actually affected the users, and, what bigger lessons we can maybe pull from this about security when companies outsource work.
And it's a really important topic. Understanding these kinds of events, especially how third parties fit in, is just crucial if you're in the digital asset world. We'll focus on synthesizing the information you gave us, pulling out the most important insights for you.
Okay, let's dive right in then. The core incident, according to the sources you sent, it seems to revolve around someone working in India for Taskus.
Right, Taskus, the U.S. outsourcing firm.
Exactly. And they were doing customer support for Coinbase. That's the exchange involved here. Now, the details in the articles are quite specific. This Taskus worker was apparently caught red-handed photographing their workstation screen. And the sources suggest they weren't acting solo. There was supposedly an accomplice involved, and together they were allegedly funneling sensitive customer info, stuff they got through their job, to cyber criminals. For bribes, it seems.
What's really striking here, looking at your sources, is how this wasn't necessarily a super complex technical hack.
Right.
It sounds more like an alleged insider threat, combined with criminals getting someone on the inside, targeting the human side of customer support.
So not breaking through firewalls, but exploiting authorized access.
Precisely. Someone allegedly misusing the access they already had in that outsourced setup. And the immediate consequences, as the material point out, were pretty drastic at Taskus itself. Mass firings reported, over 200 employees in Indoor let go because of this.
Wow, yeah, over 200. That's significant. But, okay, here's where the timeline, based on your sources, gets really interesting and maybe a bit murky. The suggestion is that Coinbase might have known something was up with outsourced agents, potentially related to a breach, maybe as early as January 2025.
That's what the sources seem to indicate, yeah, January 2025. But the full public acknowledgement of this specific large-scale leak didn't happen until May, months later, in an SEC filing.
Which naturally raises questions, right? Questions the sources themselves seem to be asking. Why the gap? Was it just investigation time or something else?
And that May filing, the timing is interesting too, isn't it? According to the material you provided, it was apparently triggered because Coinbase received a ransom demand linked to that stolen data.
Ah, so not necessarily a proactive, we found this, here's what happened, disclosure.
That's the implication in the sources, yes. And if you try to connect the dots presented in the material, there's this suggestion, it might link back to something Coinbase mentioned earlier, a big loss, around $400 million, that they tie to support agents overseas.
Okay, so the sources are hinting this specific breach and the fraud it enabled could be part of that bigger picture.
It's definitely a connection the material seems to be making, yeah, that this wasn't necessarily isolated from that previously mentioned financial impact.
Right. So let's talk about the people affected, the users. How many and what kind of data actually got out? Your sources state over 69,000 customers.
Yeah, nearly 70,000. And this is a really key point the sources make. The data itself apparently wasn't enough for the criminals to just log into Coinbase accounts. No passwords, no private keys, that kind of thing.
Okay, so not direct wallet access.
Correct. But, and this is crucial, the data was apparently perfect for social engineering. It allegedly contained enough personal details, maybe account status, support history, things like that.
Things that would make a scammer sound totally legit if they called you up pretending to be from Coinbase support.
Exactly that. They could sound incredibly convincing because they knew things a random scammer wouldn't. They could use that data to build trust and then trick users, manipulate them into revealing login info, sending crypto, or compromising their own accounts.
So exploiting the human element again, using the leaked data as leverage.
Precisely. It shows how dangerous even seemingly non-critical data can be when it's used cleverly for social engineering scams.
That really drives home the risk. Now, the sources do mention Coinbase said it reimbursed the users who lost funds, which is, important.
Definitely a necessary step for the victims.
But the sources also suggest that reimbursement doesn't quite close the book on the questions about, well, the disclosure timeline and maybe the overall transparency around the whole thing.
Right. Those questions about the delay between potential initial awareness in January and the May disclosure, especially one prompted by a ransom demand, they linger in the discussion presented in your sources. It fuels that debate about corporate responsibility, doesn't it?
It does. Okay, let's pivot to TaskUs, the outsourcing partner where the leak allegedly originated. The sources you sent mention a class action lawsuit filed against them.
Yeah, alleging negligence.
The core argument seems to be that TaskUs didn't have strong enough safeguards, that they failed to prevent an employee from, well, basically walking out with sensitive data.
And Taskus, according to the sources, denies this. But the situation, as framed in the material, does bring up these broader concerns about outsourcing sensitive stuff, right? Especially customer interactions involving data.
You mean the risks involved when you hand that work over?
Yeah, particularly when it involves large workforces, maybe in regions with lower wages. The sources raise this point not judging, but observing that while it saves costs, maybe those workers could be underpaid or undertrained compared to in-house teams.
Which might make them more vulnerable to bribes or pressure from criminals.
That's the potential vulnerability the sources seem to highlight. It's not saying outsourcing is inherently bad, but that the security controls, the vetting, the monitoring it all needs to be incredibly robust when you're dealing with third parties handling sensitive customer information.
It really shines a light on that balance companies have to strike, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Cost versus security.
Absolutely. The sources emphasize that vigilance is key, especially with these large distributed workforces handling critical data.
Okay, circling back to Coinbase, what do the sources say about their response beyond reimbursement, and what about their own internal systems?
Well, Coinbase, according to the material, insists they acted decisively once they confirmed the fraud. Cut ties with the bad agents, beefed up security protocols.
Standard response playbook, perhaps?
Perhaps. But the sources you shared also probe deeper, questioning Coinbase's own internal threat detection. They point to Coinbase's regulatory filings, their own documents, which apparently admitted that this unauthorized access by outsourced agents had been happening for previous months before that May disclosure.
So even if they acted when they found it, the sources suggest it took months to find it?
That's the implication raised in the material, yes. It suggests a possible gap in their ability to detect this kind of insider threat coming from their third-party partners quickly.
A potential blind spot in the monitoring.
Could be. And there's another layer the sources add. This Cascas incident apparently wasn't a one-off. It was reportedly part of a wider campaign targeting other outsourcing firms, BPOs, that were also working for Coinbase.
Oh, wow. So it wasn't just TaskUs. The attackers were going after multiple support vendors.
That's what the sources suggest, which implies the attackers saw this as a systemic weak point, targeting the outsourced support structure itself, not just getting lucky with one employee at one company.
That definitely broadens the scope. Makes it less about one rogue employee and more about a potential vulnerability in the whole outsourced ecosystem Coinbase was using.
Yeah, it raises the stakes for any company relying heavily on that model for sensitive functions.
So let's try to tie this all together for you, the listener, based on the sources you provided. What does it all mean?
Well, it's a stark example of the complexities of running these global digital businesses, isn't it?
It really is. It underlines the risks in outsourcing sensitive work, even if the data leaked isn't like direct wallet keys.
Right. It shows how creative criminals can be, shifting to social engineering. And it definitely puts a spotlight on corporate transparency and how companies communicate, or maybe don't communicate, when breaches happen through their partners.
We've walked through the details from your sources, the alleged insider, the questionable timeline, the roles of Coinbase and TaskUs, and that critical social engineering angle that hurt the users.
We saw how data, even if not technically compromising accounts directly, becomes a powerful tool for scammers. And we explored those tough questions your sources raise about security practices and transparency when third parties are involved in these big global service chains.
Yeah, the material you shared gave us a really clear, if worrying, look at this specific case and the arguments around what went wrong.
So maybe the thought to leave you with is this. As companies lean more and more on these complex global networks for things like customer support, how do they really strike that balance between being efficient and keeping user data genuinely secure across the entire chain?
And related to that, what level of transparency should you, as a user, reasonably expect when something goes wrong, especially when it involves third parties you might not even know are handling your information?
Definitely something to think about.
Indeed. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into your sources.